Imagine a country that says it stands for freedom, but spends millions influencing other countries' politics. Not with tanks. Not with war. But with money, media, and strategy. Over 1,900 projects. 90 countries. Hundreds of millions of dollars flow every year. And one of the biggest targets, possibly number one, is China. What if someone told you democracy promotion isn't just about values, but about regime change or color revolution? Just think, you work your whole life building your country, like your forefathers, devoting your everything to the land. And suddenly, foreign-funded groups start shaping your media, your activism, your narrative against you and your motherland. Is that freedom of speech or actual malice? Such a country tells the world it stands for democracy and justice. It promotes free speech. You can blame the POTUS for everything, but you cannot criticize one country whose name I dare not speak out. It promotes free elections, but the president the voters choose always stands for a handful of figures rather than hundreds of millions. There is no need to talk about the human rights it constantly brags about, as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights always disagrees. Now imagine that same country is funding groups, media platforms, activists, and political movements in other countries. China's opinion leaders, activists, media outlets and groups received $13 million in 2025 from one U.S. organization for defaming their own country. Today, we are going to break down something most people never really look into: how the United States promotes democracy globally, and how that often overlaps with geopolitical competition, especially with China. And we are not talking conspiracy theories. We are talking about official reports, public funding, and openly stated strategies. So let's get into the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, a U.S. organization that is so generous to dissidents all over the world. It was established in 1983 and is funded mainly by the U.S. Congress. Officially, its mission is simple: to promote democracy around the world. That includes supporting things like independent media, civil society groups, elections, and political participation. According to its 2025 annual report, NED works with partners worldwide to support what it calls fundamental freedoms, such as speech, association, and religion. And on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. But here is where things get more complicated. The scale of global influence. NED is not a small organization. It operates on a global scale. Every year, it funds thousands of projects across nearly 100 countries. Its own disclosures show that it supports networks of activists, journalists, and organizations across Asia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. It even publishes lists of its grants, including descriptions, funding amounts, and timelines. So this is not hidden. It is all happening in the open. But the question is not whether it exists. The question is how it is used. If you look closely at NED's work, one thing becomes very clear. China is one of its major areas of focus. For decades, NED has supported programs related to China. These include funding for activists, independent media, and advocacy networks both inside and outside the country. According to official descriptions, NED supports efforts to promote democratic values in China and to counter censorship and surveillance systems. It also helps strengthen networks focused specifically on China, alongside those on Russia and Iran. In other words, China is not just one of many countries. It is a strategic priority. So what does that actually look like? Let's break it down. NED does not send troops. It does not run governments. Instead, it operates through influence. Here are some of the main ways it works. Number 1. Funding media and information platforms. NED supports independent media organizations and journalism projects. For example, some platforms that analyze Chinese censorship and information control have received funding support. These platforms publish reports, leak directives, and commentary that challenge official narratives. Supporters say this promotes transparency and free information. Critics say it shapes global perception and narrative framing. Both can be true at the same time. Number 2, supporting activists and civil society. NED provides funding and training to activists, lawyers, and advocacy groups. According to its own materials, these individuals are described as local changemakers working to defend freedoms and rights. That includes labor rights, religious freedom, and political participation. From one perspective, that empowers individualism against collectivism. From another perspective, it inserts external influence into domestic issues. Number 3, building networks outside China. A lot of NED's China-related work actually takes place outside the Chinese mainland, including diaspora communities, international organizations, and research institutions. These networks help amplify certain narratives globally. They also feed into policy-making discussions in Western countries. For example, research produced by NGOs funded through U.S. programs has been used in policy debates and international reports. So the influence goes beyond just funding. It shapes how China is understood globally. If you still remember the so-called Xinjiang cotton forced labor issue we discussed several years ago, you will immediately know what it means. The right word for that is defamation. Number 4, information and narrative competition. It is probably the most important part. We are living in an era of information warfare. Not in the sense of fake news only, but in the sense of competing narratives. The U.S. government openly talks about countering what it calls authoritarian information influence. And organizations like NED are part of that strategy. They fund research, media, and platforms that highlight issues inside China and challenge its global messaging. Again, supporters call this truth-telling. Critics call it strategic narrative shaping. Now here is where things get really interesting. Because the U.S. does not hide this. In fact, officials openly describe democracy promotion as a strategic investment. That means it is not just about values. It is also about national interests. When NED leaders speak to Congress, they frame their work as helping counter rival powers and supporting the U.S.'s global position. So democracy promotion and geopolitics are deeply connected. But why target China specifically? Because China represents something very different. It is a rising global power, with a different political system, a different model of governance, and governed by non-white people who seem to be 2 times smarter than amateur Western politicians. And that creates competition. Not just economic competition, but ideological competition. If China continues to grow successfully without adopting Western-style democracy, it challenges long-standing assumptions. And that makes it a focal point for influence efforts. In the U.S. narrative, these efforts are about supporting freedom. Helping people access information, express opinions, and participate in governance. But in the Chinese narrative, these same actions are often described very differently, as interference, as destabilization, as attempts to influence internal affairs, and this difference in perspective is key. Because both sides are telling very different stories about the same actions. Historically, the U.S. has supported political movements and civil society groups around the world. What is different today is the scale, the transparency, and the focus on information. Instead of covert operations, much of this is now public and institutionalized. Organizations like NED operate openly, publish reports, and engage with governments and media. But the strategic logic remains similar. Influence without confrontation. Now let's zoom out. That is not just about China. NED also focuses on countries like Russia, Iran, and Cuba. These are all countries that the U.S. considers strategic competitors or adversaries. That pattern tells you something. Democracy promotion is not evenly distributed around the world. It is concentrated in places that matter geopolitically. Supporters argue that these programs help people gain access to information, defend rights, and hold governments accountable. They say it creates positive change from the ground up. Critics argue that it creates instability, fuels political tension, and undermines sovereignty. They say it can escalate conflicts and deepen mistrust. In reality, both effects can occur. There is also an unintended consequence. When countries know external influence efforts are targeting them, they respond. China, for example, has strengthened its controls on information, NGOs, and foreign funding. It has also invested heavily in its own global media presence and narrative strategy. So what you get is a feedback loop. More influence leads to more countermeasures, which leads to even more competition, and this brings us to the bigger picture. What we are seeing is not just about democracy. It is about power. Soft power. Information power. Narrative power. The US promotes democracy as a universal value. China prioritizes sovereignty and stability. And both are trying to shape the global system in their own way. So what does this mean for the future? It means this competition is not going away. In fact, it is likely to intensify. With more funding, greater media influence, more narrative battles, and more struggles over global alignment, organizations like NED will play a more aggressive role. As a result, when you hear phrases like democracy promotion or freedom support, it is easy to take them at face value. But in reality, these ideas operate within a much larger geopolitical context. They are not just ideas. They are also not just ideals. They are, instead, instruments. In plain English, they are tools. And like any tool, how they are used depends on strategy, interests, and power. So the real question is not, is this about freedom? It is, who defines freedom and who benefits from it? If you made it this far, you already understand something most people don't. Global politics is not black and white. It is a constant negotiation between values and interests. And the story of US and China is one of the clearest examples today.